The hull breach alarm screamed through the Vethkai dreadnought Ashker Ven at 3:14 station time, and by 3:16, the entire port ventral quarter was already venting atmosphere into the cold of the Pelori drift. Damage Control Officer Sareth Kale felt the deck shudder beneath his clawed feet and knew, with the certainty of 23 years in the Vethkai Naval Compact, that this was not a drill. The sound was wrong. Drills produced a steady, measured tone that cycled in 3-second intervals. This was a shriek, a sustained, climbing wail that meant the breach sensors had given up trying to classify the damage and were simply screaming at anything alive to move. He was already running before the second pulse hit. The Ashker Ven was a Vethkai heavy carrier, 1,200 meters of layered armor and redundant pressure systems, 4,000 crew, 96 compartments across 14 operational decks. She had been built to survive anything the Pelori drift could throw at her: micrometeorite swarms, radiation spikes, the occasional rogue gravity well that bent local space hard enough to crack lesser ships in half. She had not been built to survive what happened next. Sareth rounded the corridor junction at frame 41 and nearly collided with Sub-Officer Thren, whose scales had gone a pale ash gray that meant she was terrified. Thren was a 15-year veteran. Sareth had never seen her scales lose color. "Deck 9 through Deck 14, sir," she said, and her voice was remarkably steady for someone whose body was broadcasting fear in every shade. "All 6 decks reporting simultaneous breach, cascade failure in the pressure bulkheads, the containment fields they're not holding." 6 decks. Sareth stopped walking. 6 simultaneous breaches was not a malfunction. It was not a micrometeorite strike. It was structural failure on a scale that should not have been possible on a ship that had passed her integrity review 9 days ago. "Cause?" he asked. "The reactor coolant spine fractured. Thermal shock propagated through the port strut lattice. The bulkheads, the temperature differential cracked them, sir, all at once." A reactor coolant spine fracture. The single worst non-combat casualty event in Vethkai engineering. The coolant spine ran the full length of the ship, a pressurized column of hypercooled thermal medium that kept the main reactor from melting through its own containment. If the spine cracked, the temperature differential between the coolant and the surrounding hull structure could exceed 4,000 degrees in under a minute. Metal that had been supercooled on one side and superheated on the other did not bend. It shattered. 6 decks. Sareth's mind was already doing the math. Decks 9 through 14 port ventral quarter. That was crew berthing, 2 auxiliary engineering sections, the secondary medical bay, the port weapons battery, and the main cargo handling bay. At this hour, with the ship on third watch, those decks held somewhere between 700 and 900 crew. "Seal everything above Deck 8, he ordered. "Evacuate the port ventral quarter, all personnel, no exceptions. What's the atmospheric loss rate?" Thren checked her wrist display. The numbers reflected off her ash-pale scales. "We're losing pressure at 11% per minute in the affected section. At current rate, complete atmosphere loss in the port ventral quarter in approximately 9 minutes. 9 minutes to get 900 people through emergency corridors and pressure hatches that might or might not still be functional." Sareth started running again. The first compartment he reached was berthing Bay 9 Alpha, a crew quarters section on Deck 9 that held 64 enlisted personnel. The door was sealed. The automatic lockdown had done that much, but the pressure indicator on the panel was already amber, dropping toward red. He could hear the hiss through the door. Not loud, not dramatic, just a steady, patient whisper that meant the room on the other side was bleeding out. He opened it. The berthing bay was chaos. 64 crew members, most of them in sleeping garments, trying to reach the emergency gear lockers. The lockers were on the far wall. Between the crew and the lockers, the deck had buckled a ridge of warped metal 2 feet high that ran diagonally across the room, a scar left by the thermal shock that had cracked the coolant spine 3 decks below. Emergency breathers are in the ceiling drop panels, Sareth shouted. He knew the lockers were unreachable. The ceiling panels were closer. Reach up, twist the red handle, pull down. You have 4 minutes of air in each unit. Move. They moved. Vethkai were not a species prone to panic. Their evolutionary heritage as ambush predators had given them a cold, clinical focus under stress that other species sometimes mistook for fearlessness. It was not fearlessness. It was the ancient, hard-coded instinct that said, when the ground shifts, go still, assess, and act. Screaming was for species whose survival strategy was to attract help. Vethkai survived by solving problems. The ceiling panels came down. Breathers went on. Sareth counted heads 61, 3 missing. Aft head, someone said. A young rating, scales still dark with youth. 3 went to the aft head before the alarm. The aft head was a sanitary compartment at the back of the berthing bay, separated by a pressure door. Sareth checked the panel. Red. The compartment beyond the door had already lost atmosphere. He pulled up the external feed on his wrist unit. The aft head was open to space. The thermal crack had run directly through its outer wall. There was nothing on the other side of that door but vacuum and 3 bodies that were already beyond help. 61. He logged it in his head and moved on. Berthing Bay 9 Beta was next, 30 meters down the corridor. The pressure door was jammed. The frame had warped just enough to prevent the hydraulic seal from engaging. Sareth and Thren forced it manually, bracing their boots against the corridor wall and hauling on the emergency release lever until the door groaned open on twisted rails. Inside, 42 crew had already found their breathers. 2 more were trapped under a collapsed ceiling conduit, the metal pinning them at the waist. Sareth and Thren lifted the conduit together. It took everything Sareth had, the metal still radiating residual heat from the thermal pulse, and the 2 crew members scrambled free, scales flushed dark with pain. 44. Add them to the 61. 105 so far and 5 dead. The next 4 minutes were a blur of corridors, pressure doors, and numbers. Every compartment he reached, he counted. Every compartment he could not reach, he logged. The pattern was brutally consistent. The thermal fracture had propagated from the coolant spine outward in a radial pattern, cracking the hull along stress lines that the original builders had never anticipated, because no one had ever seen a coolant spine fail in a ship this young. Deck 10, 42 of 51 crew recovered. 9 lost to a compartment that had decompressed before anyone could reach a breather. Deck 11, 78 of 83. 5 caught in a corridor junction when both pressure doors failed simultaneously. Sareth found the corridor sealed on both ends, the atmosphere gauges reading 0. He stood at the door for 3 seconds, looking at the indicator. 3 seconds was all he allowed himself. Then he logged the 5 and moved to the next section. Deck 12, complete evacuation. 104 crew made it up to Deck 8 before the section lost integrity. A small miracle. The section chief, a veteran named Korath, had started the evacuation on his own authority before the official order came down, because he had felt the deck vibration change and had not waited to be told what it meant. Deck 13, the secondary medical bay. Sareth arrived to find the chief medical officer, a female Vethkai named Dreadnought Vaz, performing surgery on a patient who had been undergoing a routine procedure when the alarms hit. Dreadnought had sealed the operating theater and pressurized it independently from the rest of the deck, burning through emergency atmosphere canisters at a rate that would give her maybe 12 minutes of air. "I need 6 more minutes," she said when Sareth appeared at the observation window. Her hands were inside the patient's abdomen. The instruments in her fingers were steady. The monitor above the table showed vital signs that were still, impossibly, within surgical parameters. "You have 4, he said. "Then I will work faster." She did. The patient was closed and on a stretcher in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Sareth carried the stretcher himself while Drenel carried the portable life support unit. They made it to the Deck 8 seal with 8 seconds of atmosphere left in the operating theater's emergency supply. But the deck was not finished with them. As Sareth passed the portable triage station that the medical staff had thrown together in the Deck 8 corridor, he saw the scope of what had been pulled from the lower decks. 41 wounded, laid out on emergency blankets in 2 rows against the corridor walls. Thermal burns, decompression injuries, 3 crew with bone fractures from the deck buckling. 1 unconscious rating whose breather had failed, and who had been breathing vacuum for an estimated 40 seconds before a crewmate found him and forced a seal. Drenel took one look at the triage line and began triaging without breaking stride. The patient on the stretcher went to the end of the row. She went to the unconscious rating first, checked his pupils, checked his pulse, and said, "Hypoxic but viable. Get me the oxygen concentrate from that canister, the one with the blue valve, not the green." Her hands did not shake. Her scales were the color of old bone, but her hands did not shake. Sareth left her there and kept moving, because the lower decks were still collapsing. Deck 14 was gone. The entire deck had depressurized within the first 90 seconds of the fracture. Sareth did not try to reach it. The 76 crew who had been stationed there were already dead before the alarm had finished its first cycle. He had known 3 of them. Sub-Commander Keith Ravon, who ran the port weapons battery and played distance chess with Sareth every 3rd watch. Rating First Class Denal Thek, who had been on his damage control team for 6 years, and who had a way of finding structural faults by sound alone. He would press his ear to a bulkhead and listen, the way a physician listened to a heartbeat, and tell you whether the metal was healthy or sick. And Supply Officer Morith, who had requisitioned the new ceiling drop panels for Deck 9's berthing bay 8 months ago, the same panels that had just saved 61 lives because someone had made sure they were stocked and maintained. 789 crew in the affected section. By the time the last pressure door on Deck 8 sealed and held, Sareth had recovered 696. 93 were dead. The number settled into him like a stone dropped into deep water. He would carry it for the rest of his life, and he knew that, and he did not have time to feel it now. Because the ship was still dying. The coolant spine fracture had done more than crack 6 decks open to vacuum. Without the coolant spine, the main reactor was running on residual thermal medium only. The engineering team reported that they had perhaps 40 minutes before the reactor containment began to degrade. If containment failed, the reactor would not explode. Vethkai reactors were not designed to explode, but it would melt through the engineering deck and begin vaporizing the structural members that held the ship together. The Ashker Ven would not die in fire. She would come apart, slowly, piece by piece, as her own skeleton dissolved beneath her. And the damage was still spreading. Thren reported from the monitoring station that the thermal gradient was propagating forward into the structural lattice above the compromised decks. Decks 7 and 8, currently their safe haven, were showing stress indicators along the portside frames. Not critical, not yet, but the metal was talking, and what it was saying was that the line Sareth had drawn at Deck 8 might not hold as long as he needed it to. Captain Vethrin Dahl, commanding officer, addressed the surviving crew from the bridge. "We have sent a distress signal on all compact frequencies," she said. Her voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a captain who had already done the arithmetic and understood the answer. "The nearest compact response fleet is 11 hours out. Our reactor containment will fail in approximately 35 minutes. We are attempting to reach the Kale 3-way station at sublight, but at current speed we will not arrive for 6 hours. I will not soften this. The mathematics are not in our favor." The bridge crew received this with the cold stillness of Vethkai under pressure. No one spoke. No one moved. Sareth, standing at the damage control station on the bridge's lower tier, stared at the schematic of the ship on his display and watched the red spread. 6 decks gone, 3 more showing structural warnings, the reactor containment clock ticking down, 11 hours to the nearest friendly response, 35 minutes to catastrophic degradation. The mathematics were not in their favor. The captain was right. The captain was always right about mathematics. Then the comm officer's voice cut through the silence. "Captain, I'm reading a response to our distress signal." Captain Dahl turned. "Compact fleet." "No, ma'am, the signature, it's Terran." The bridge went still in a different way. Not the stillness of acceptance, the stillness of confusion. There were no Terran ships in the Pelori Drift. The Pelori Drift was deep compact space, 4 relay jumps from the nearest human trade corridor. The idea that a Terran vessel would be monitoring compact distress frequencies in this sector was absurd. "Verify," the captain said. "Verified, ma'am. The signal identifies as the TRS Caldera Point, Terran Rescue Service, heavy response vessel. They are requesting our position, damage assessment, and crew count. They say they are 14 minutes out." 14 minutes. The number landed on the bridge like a physical blow. 14 minutes from a species that had no business being here, in a ship whose designation, Terran Rescue Service, sounded like it had been purpose-built for exactly this. "How large is the vessel?" Sareth asked. He could not stop himself. It was not his place to query bridge comm, but the number 14 minutes had shaken something loose in his professional restraint. The comm officer checked her readings twice before answering. "Displacement reads at approximately 3 times our mass. I'm also reading auxiliary vessel signatures, at least 2 support craft docked to the primary hull. 3 times the mass of a Vethkai heavy carrier. A rescue ship 3 times the size of the warship it was coming to save." "Respond," Captain Dahl said. "Send them everything." The data package went out. Ship class, crew count, nature of the damage, reactor status, atmospheric readings, structural integrity maps. Everything the Ashker Ven knew about her own dying body, transmitted to a ship that was still, at that moment, nothing more than a calm signature and a promise. The response came back in under 2 minutes. Not a request for clarification, not a follow-up question, an operational plan. "Captain," the comm officer said, and Sareth noticed that her voice had changed. It was not calm anymore. It was careful, the way a person's voice became when they were reading something they did not entirely believe. "The Caldera Point acknowledges our data. They are dispatching a damage control boarding team. 42 personnel. They are requesting permission to dock at our port ventral maintenance airlock. They are also deploying an atmospheric tanker to supplement our hull pressure from the exterior, and their secondary craft will station keep above our compromised decks to provide emergency evacuation capacity if containment fails." 3 separate actions: the boarding team, the atmospheric support, and the evacuation backup. All dispatched simultaneously, all coordinated, all planned in the 2 minutes it had taken them to read a damage report on an alien ship they had never visited. "The port ventral maintenance airlock is on Deck 11, Sareth said. Deck 11 is compromised. Atmospheric integrity is at 18% and falling." "They know that, sir." Their message reads, "Acknowledged. Our team will operate in vacuum and hard seal conditions. Requesting dock clearance. We bring our own air." "We bring our own air." 4 words that should not have mattered. 4 words that were, in any technical sense, a simple statement of equipment readiness. But Sareth had spent the last 20 minutes watching his ship die and counting the dead and doing the arithmetic that said everyone aboard was going to join them. And those 4 words hit him somewhere behind the sternum with a force that no piece of engineering jargon should have been able to carry. They bring their own air. They were not asking for help. They were not requesting assistance or coordinating a joint response. They were telling the Ashker Ven to open a door and stand back. Captain Dahl nodded once. "Grant clearance. All frequencies, inform the crew. Terran Rescue Vessel inbound. All damage control personnel report to Deck 8 Port Ventral Access Corridor. We are receiving a boarding team. Sareth went down to meet them. The port ventral maintenance airlock was a secondary access point on Deck 11, designed for external hull repair crews. It was small, a two-person lock, barely large enough for a suited Vethkai to turn around in. The corridor leading to it was in partial vacuum, atmosphere at 14% and dropping. Sareth sealed his environment suit and cycled through the Deck 8 pressure door with Thren and 2 junior damage control ratings. They waited in the corridor. The hull groaned around them, a low, resonant sound that Sareth felt in his teeth, the sound of metal under stress that was too great for its design tolerances. Through the transparent section of the corridor wall, he could see the stars of the Pelori drift, cold and indifferent. Then the stars moved. Something vast slid across the field of view, blocking out the drift. At first Sareth's brain refused to process it. The shape was too large, too close, moving with a speed and precision that should not have been possible for a vessel of that displacement. The Caldera Point was not a warship. She was, as her designation suggested, a rescue vessel, but she was enormous. Sareth had served aboard compact dreadnoughts his entire career, and the ship that was now matching velocity with the Ashker Ven and extending a docking collar toward the maintenance airlock was easily twice the mass of any rescue vessel he had ever seen. She was painted in high-visibility orange and white, not military gray, not tactical black. Orange and white, the colors of a species that wanted to be seen coming. The docking collar sealed with a sound like a giant's fist closing around the airlock frame. The pressure indicator on the lock jumped from 14% to 100 in under 8 seconds. The inner door opened. The first human through the lock was a woman. She was wearing a hardsuit that was scarred and dented and patched in a way that spoke of years of use rather than months. The suit was orange. On the left shoulder, stenciled in block letters that Sareth could read through his faceplate, were the words damage control. On the right shoulder, Caldera Point. She looked at Sareth. Her face, visible through her helmet's clear visor, was calm, not grim, not heroic, not performatively stoic. Just calm, the way a person looked when they had done this before and expected to do it again and had long since stopped being impressed by the scale of what was breaking. "Lieutenant Commander Patel," she said, "Terran Rescue Service. I have 41 people behind me and 6 hours of equipment. Point me at your worst." "The reactor coolant spine is fractured," Sareth said. "Full longitudinal failure. 6 decks compromised, 3 more at risk. Containment has 28 minutes before degradation begins." Patel did not flinch. She did not pause. She did not ask him to repeat the number. "Coolant spine, got it." She turned and spoke into her suit calm. "Morrow, I need the thermal team forward. Tors, get the portable spine segments off the rack. We're looking at a full longitudinal, so pull all 8. Briggs, your team takes the breach decks. Standard atmosphere restoration protocol. Start from the top and work down. Kim, get the reactor assessment team to their engineering deck. I want containment status in 90 seconds, not 28 minutes. Behind her, the airlock was cycling continuously. Humans came through in pairs, each carrying equipment that Sareth did not recognize. The gear was not Vethkai compatible. The tools were wrong. The fittings were wrong. The scale was wrong. Everything the humans carried was slightly too large, slightly too heavy, built for a species whose baseline assumptions about force and tolerance and endurance were calibrated to a planet that the rest of the galaxy considered barely survivable. Sareth watched them come through and tried to count. After the 12th pair, he stopped counting and started leading. "This way," he said. "Engineering is through the central spine corridor, Deck 7. Patel fell into step beside him. Behind them, the column of humans split into 4 teams with the smooth efficiency of a group that had rehearsed this separation 1,000 times. No one gave orders. No one waited for direction. Each team knew where it was going because they had already read the damage assessment data that the Ashker Ven had transmitted, and they had already mapped the ship's layout from the engineering specifications that every Vethkai heavy carrier was required to file with the Intersystem Navigation Registry. And they had already decided, on the 14-minute approach, exactly what they were going to do and in what order. Sareth realized as he walked that this was what the humans had been doing during those 14 minutes, not traveling, planning. As they moved through the Deck 8 corridor, Patel asked questions. Not nervous questions, not the questions of someone trying to catch up. Precise questions, each one calibrated to fill a gap in the data package the Ashker Ven had sent. Your pressure doors, are they hydraulic or magnetic seal? Hydraulic on the main frames, magnetic on the internal partitions. The bulkhead material in the lower decks, is it the same alloy grade as the upper? No, decks 9 through 14 use a high thermal tolerance composite, denser but more brittle under differential stress. That tracks. That's why the fracture pattern went radial instead of linear. Brittle composite, sudden thermal differential, it shattered instead of deforming. She said it the way a mechanic would describe a worn bearing, not surprised, not appalled, just cataloging. They passed the Deck 8 triage station. Patel slowed for exactly 2 strides, scanning the row of wounded crew laid out on emergency blankets. She did not stop, but she keyed her comm without breaking pace. Briggs, add to your sweep. Deck 8 corridor has a triage station, approximately 40 wounded, some critical. When you clear the breach decks, have Chen and Vasquez set up a secondary medical station. Use our field kits extended trauma, not standard. They've got decompression injuries. Copy extended trauma, on it. 2 strides. She had assessed the medical situation in 2 strides and tasked a team on it. Sareth looked at the 41 wounded lining his corridor. People, his own medical staff, were struggling to stabilize and said nothing. Behind them, the last of the 42 humans cleared the airlock and dispersed. The maintenance corridor was suddenly quiet, the bootfalls of the boarding teams already fading into the lower decks. Sareth heard a distant clang metal on metal, and then the whine of a cutting tool spinning up. Someone had already started working. The first team, Briggs's team. Sareth learned reached Deck 10 before Sareth and Patel reached Deck 7. He heard them on the damage control frequency, a channel the humans had patched into without asking, their transmissions mixing with the Vethkai crews in a polyglot of technical shorthand. Deck 10, Section 4, hull breach, 3-meter lateral fracture, setting the patch. Martinez, give me the sealant gun and the number 4 brace. This one's a compression fracture, not a shear, we can bridge it. Sareth had spent 8 minutes on Deck 10 and had written it off. The fracture in Section 4 was too wide, the structural deformation too severe. He had sealed the section and moved on because there was no equipment aboard the Ashker Ven that could bridge a 3-meter compression fracture in compromised hull plating. The humans had equipment that could bridge it. They carried it in their hands, and it took them 4 minutes. Deck 10, Section 4 sealed and pressurizing, Briggs reported, moving to Section 7. Sareth stopped walking. He stood in the central spine corridor on Deck 7 and listened to a human repair a breach that he had declared irreparable. He listened to the atmosphere readings tick upward in a section he had written off as dead. Patel looked at him. You all right? You are repairing Deck 10. That's what Briggs does. I declared Deck 10 unrecoverable. Patel's expression did not change. Different tools, she said. Come on, show me the reactor. On his wrist unit, the damage control feed was scrolling with updates from Briggs's team. Each one hit Sareth like a small detonation. Deck 10, Section 7, secondary fracture 1.4 meters, sealed, pressurizing. Deck 10, Section 12, pressure door warped off track, realigned and receded, corridor open. Deck 10, Section 15, atmosphere vent in ceiling conduit. Patched. Note, found 3 crew in emergency shelter pocket, breathing, routing them to Deck 8. 3 crew. 3 more lives pulled back from the column of the dead. Sareth had written off Section 15. He had assumed the atmospheric failure was total. The humans had found a pocket of air, a fold in the ship's damage pattern where 3 Vethkai had survived by pressing themselves into an equipment alcove and breathing through the thin reserve of oxygen trapped in the insulated conduit space above them. The humans had found them in less than 6 minutes. Sareth's team had not checked because the atmospheric sensors for that section had read 0. The sensors had been wrong, or more precisely, the sensors had been reading the corridor atmosphere, not the insulated pocket 2 meters above it. The humans had checked anyway. On Deck 11, Briggs split his team. Half continued the breach repairs. The other half began something that Sareth had not requested and had not anticipated: structural reinforcement. They were not just sealing the cracks. They were reinforcing the hull around the cracks, adding bracing and bonded support struts to sections that were technically intact, but that the thermal shock had weakened to the point where any further stress would breach them. Sareth watched the structural integrity readings on his display. The numbers for Deck 11, which had been declining steadily since the fracture event, stopped declining. Then they began to rise. Slowly, a fraction of a percent at a time, but rising. The humans were not just stopping the bleeding. They were healing the wound. "Briggs," Patel said over the comm, "status on the bracing." 7 sections reinforced on 11. Starting 12. The composites responding well to the bonding agent, better than steel, actually. We could get this ship to 92% structural if you give me another 2 hours. You've got 1. Prioritize the sections adjacent to the spine housing. I don't want any lateral stress on the sleeves while they cure. Copy. Meanwhile, Chen and Vasquez had reached the triage station on Deck 8. Sareth monitored the comm traffic as they set up. The 2 humans arrived carrying cases that unfolded into full field surgical stations, portable diagnostic units, oxygen concentrators, a device that Drenel later described as a localized atmospheric pressure stabilizer, which could create a bubble of normalized pressure around a single patient, effectively giving the Vethkai medical staff a clean operating environment in the middle of a compromised corridor. Drenel, who had been working with emergency canisters and improvised equipment for 40 minutes, looked at the human medical kits being assembled and stood very still for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "These are better than what we have in our primary medical bay." Chen, a human whose face was young but whose hands moved with decades of certainty, simply nodded. "We'll set up 3 stations. You tell us which patients are priority. Your people, your triage order." Within 10 minutes, the corridor that had been a desperate collection of wounded on blankets became something that resembled an actual medical facility. 3 pressure-stabilized treatment stations, oxygen flowing, diagnostic screens reading vital signs in Vethkai medical notation. The humans' equipment had converted automatically. The 3 crew pulled from the shelter pocket on Deck 10 were carried up and placed in the 3rd station, dehydrated and shaking but alive. Drenel worked beside the humans and did not comment on the fact that they had brought equipment calibrated to a species they had never formally provided medical aid to. She did not ask how they knew the Vethkai atmospheric mixture, or the Vethkai blood gas parameters, or the correct pressure tolerance for Vethkai respiratory tissue. She simply used what they gave her, and the number of wounded who were stable rose from 11 to 34 in 20 minutes. The rating who had breathed vacuum, the one Drenel had marked hypoxic, but viable, was the last to stabilize. Chen stayed on him personally, adjusting the oxygen flow in tiny increments, monitoring the blood gas readings with a focus that Drenel described afterward as surgical. The rating's vitals steadied at minute 16. Chen checked the readout, nodded once, and moved to the next patient without comment. The main engineering deck of the Ashker Ven was a cathedral of metal and energy, a vast space that hummed with the deep harmonic of the reactor core. Under normal conditions, the core produced a steady, low-frequency vibration that every crew member felt in their bones, the heartbeat of the ship. Now the heartbeat was a rhythmic, stuttering, the vibration spiking and dropping in irregular patterns that made Sarath's scales itch. The engineering team, what was left of it, had done everything they could. Chief Engineer Malkan had jury-rigged a secondary cooling loop using water reserves from the environmental systems, buying them time. But the jury-rig was failing. The water was boiling off faster than the pumps could cycle it, and the temperature in the reactor containment chamber was climbing at a rate that would hit critical in 22 minutes. Patel's reactor assessment team arrived ahead of her. By the time Sarath led Patel onto the engineering deck, 3 humans were already inside the containment monitoring station, running diagnostics on equipment that was not designed for their hands, reading displays in a language they had apparently learned on the approach. "Report," Patel said. A human named Kim, compact, dark-haired, with the kind of focus in his eyes that reminded Sarath of Vethkai predator caste elders, spoke, without looking up from the containment readout. "The spine is fractured at 3 points. Longest fracture is 2.7 meters. The thermal medium has fully evacuated from the fractured segments. The secondary cooling loop, nice work, by the way, is holding but degrading. We've got about 19 minutes on the current loop before it fails. The containment walls are at 73% structural, below 60 triggers cascade." Malkan, the chief engineer, heard the compliment "nice work," and his scales flushed a shade darker. He had been running that jury-rig for 30 minutes on nothing but instinct and training. A human he had never met had just told him in 2 words that it was good engineering. "Can we splice the spine?" Patel asked. "We can sleeve it, 3 sleeves, 1 per fracture. Each sleeve takes about 12 minutes to set. Problem, we can't set them sequentially. By the time we finish the third, the first one's already under thermal load and we've lost the window. We need to set all 3 simultaneously." "How many people per sleeve?" "2 minimum, 3 preferred." "I've got tours and 5 people on spine duty. Split them 2 teams of 3. I'll take the third fracture myself with Morrow." Sarath looked at her. "You are going to enter the coolant spine housing." "That's the job." "The housing is at 600 degrees. The thermal medium, even evacuated, leaves residual radiation in the. Our suits are rated to 900. We've got time." Patel was already moving. She turned back once and looked at Sarath with an expression that he would remember for the rest of his career. It was not pity. It was not condescension. It was the expression of someone who understood completely that the person in front of them had been fighting alone and that the fighting alone part was over now. "Officer Kale," she said, "your ship lost 93 people tonight. I can't change that number, but the number stops here. I need you to manage the atmosphere restoration on the breach decks while my team handles the spine. Can you do that?" He could do that. He was Vethkai damage control. Managing atmosphere in a broken ship was what he had been trained to do since he was 17. "Yes," he said. "Good. Then let's save the rest of them." The next 50 minutes were the most extraordinary thing Sarath Kale had ever witnessed in a career spent watching ships try to die and people try to stop them. On Deck 10, Briggs's team completed their sweep. Every hull breach sealed, every compromised corridor repressurized. The molecular adhesive they used, a substance Sarath would later learn, was a Terran invention developed for deep ocean pressure vessel repair, adapted for vacuum use, set in under 90 seconds, and could hold against full differential. Each breach went from fracture to sealed in under 5 minutes. The team worked without conversation, without hesitation, each member anticipating the next move with the fluid coordination of people who had been broken and rebuilt by repetition, until the work was embedded in their reflexes. On deck 11, Akanjo, a human whose arms were thick enough that Sareth could see the muscle definition through his hardsuit, cut through a collapsed bulkhead that had trapped 14 Vethkai crew members in a sealed compartment with 40 minutes of air. The compartment had been on Sareth's list. He had estimated 90 minutes to cut through the bulkhead with Vethkai tools. Akanjo's team was through in 11. The 14 crew members came out shaking, scales pale, eyes wide. They looked at the humans who had cut them free, and Sareth saw on their faces the expression that he was beginning to understand was universal. The look of someone who had accepted death and then been informed by strangers that the acceptance was premature. One of the 14, a senior technician named Valish, stopped in front of Akanjo and tried to speak. The words did not come. She stood there, mouth working, scales cycling through shades of gray that Sareth had never seen in a single Vethkai at once. Akanjo waited 2 seconds, then put a gloved hand on her shoulder and said, "You're out. Keep moving forward. The corridor's clear to deck 8. She moved. They all moved. They were alive, and the direction of alive was forward. On deck 12, the atmosphere restoration was underway. Sareth coordinated with Briggs's team to repressurize sections in sequence, working from the top deck downward, sealing each section as it reached breathable levels and then moving to the next. The Vethkai crew, working alongside the humans for the first time, discovered something that Sareth had already noticed. The humans did not slow down. The humans did not pause. They did not verify between steps. They moved from one task to the next with a relentlessness that was, Sareth realized, not haste and not recklessness, but something else entirely, a deep, bone-level refusal to accept that the interval between actions was anything other than wasted time. They worked the way a current flowed, continuously, without interruption, filling every gap the moment it appeared. A Vethkai crew member on deck 12, a young engineer named Tessic, tried to keep pace with the human working beside her on a hull patch. After 10 minutes, she stepped back, breathing hard, her scales darkened with exertion. The human glanced at her, said, "Take 60 seconds," and continued working without slowing. Tessic took her 60 seconds. When she returned, the human had finished the patch alone and was already moving to the next section. He handed her a sealant applicator without looking at her and said, "This one's yours. Start at the left edge." She started at the left edge. She did not take another break. In the coolant spine housing, Patel and her teams were setting the sleeves. Sareth monitored their progress from the damage control station on the bridge, where he had relocated to coordinate the multi-deck restoration. The spine housing was a confined space, barely wider than a human in a hardsuit, running the full length of the ship between the inner hull and the reactor core. The temperature inside was 612 degrees. The residual radiation from the evacuated thermal medium was at levels that would have required a Vethkai to rotate out every 8 minutes. Patel's teams had been in the housing for 26 minutes, no rotation. "Tours sleeve 1 status," Patel said over the comm. "Set and bonding, 12 minutes to full cure." "Chem sleeve 2. Set. Bonding now, we're on schedule." "Copy, sleeve 3 is in position. Morrow, give me the torque driver, we're setting now." Sareth watched the reactor containment readings. The temperature was still climbing, but the rate had slowed. The secondary cooling loop Malkon's jury-rig was failing, but it was failing slowly enough that the sleeves might cure before it died completely. The numbers were close. The numbers were very close. "Morrow," Patel said, and Sareth heard something shift in her voice. Not alarm, attention. "The third fracture's wider than the scan showed, the sleeves short by about 4 centimeters. A pause, then Morrow's voice. "I can pack the gap with thermal compound and overwrap it. It'll hold for about 6 hours. 6 hours is enough to reach the way station. Do it." Sareth heard the sounds of work through the comm, the hiss of thermal compound being applied, the click of the overwrap tool, the steady breathing of 2 humans working in 600-degree heat inside a space barely large enough to hold them. solving a problem that should have killed everyone aboard this ship. Sleeve 3 set and wrapped, Patel reported. All 3 fractures sleeved, beginning coolant recharge. But the ship was not done trying to die. Patel, Kim's voice sharp. We've got a secondary thermal event. The residual heat from the spine fracture is propagating into the port strut junction at frame 62. The junction bracket is reading 840 degrees and climbing. If it fails, we lose the structural connection between the forward and aft hull sections. Sarath's blood went cold. Frame 62 was the main structural junction for the port side of the ship. If the bracket failed, the Ashker vent would not crack open immediately. The remaining structural members would hold for a time, but any maneuvering stress, any course correction, any attempt to dock at the way station would bend the hull at the weakened junction and tear the ship in half. I see it, Patel said. Her voice did not change. Sarath was beginning to understand that her voice never changed. Morrow, stay on the spine. I'm going to 62. That section is outside the spine housing, Sarath said. The junction bracket is on the exterior of the port strut. You would need to go outside. Yes, Patel was already moving. Kim, what's my window before the bracket fails? At current rate, about 14 minutes, maybe less if the heat pulse spikes. I need a hull walker and a portable thermal sink. Tors, where are we on the coolant recharge? Running automated from here. You can go. Patel was at the exterior airlock in 3 minutes. Sarath followed her on the hull camera feeds, watching from the bridge as a single orange-suited figure climbed out onto the exterior hull of a ship that was radiating enough heat to soften metal. She moved across the hull with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 100 times, mag boots clicking against the plating, tether line trailing behind her, the bulk of the portable thermal sink strapped to her back. The junction bracket at frame 62 was visible even on the camera feed, a section of structural metal that was glowing a dull, angry red, the heat bleeding outward from the fractured spine through the lattice of support struts that connected the spine to the hull. I'm at 62, Patel said. The bracket's warped about 3 centimeters off true. The heat hasn't cracked it yet, but the alloy is at its deformation threshold. Setting the thermal sink now. The thermal sink was a device Sarath had never seen before, a flat, disc-shaped unit that Patel clamped directly onto the glowing bracket. The device began to draw heat from the metal, its surface shifting from black to white as it absorbed thermal energy. The bracket's red glow began to fade. Sink is drawing, temperature dropping, 810, 790, 770, good, it's responding. She worked as she talked, welding reinforcement strips around the bracket while the thermal sink brought the temperature down to workable levels. Adding 4 bracing strips. This will hold the junction until you can get a proper yard repair. Beside Sarath on the bridge, Captain Dahl watched the hull camera feed without speaking. The image was stark. One human, alone on the hull of a dying ship, clamping metal to glowing metal in the void, while behind her the orange and white bulk of the Caldera Point held station 300 meters off the beam, her floodlights painting the Ashker Ven's hull in sharp white light. The rescue ship had repositioned to illuminate Patel's work area. No one had asked her to. 7 minutes. She was on the exterior hull in vacuum, working on superheated metal for 7 minutes. When she climbed back through the airlock, she did not mention it. She simply returned to the spine housing to check on Morrow's progress with the coolant recharge. The portable coolant units had been staged at the spine access point by Tor's team. The recharge procedure, pumping fresh thermal medium into the sleeved spine sections, took 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, the reactor containment held at 64% structural integrity, 4% above cascade threshold. When the coolant began flowing again, the reactor's heartbeat steadied. The stuttering, a rhythmic vibration that had been making Sarath's scales itch for over an hour, smoothed into a deep, stable pulse. The containment temperature began to drop. On the bridge, Chief Engineer Malkan stared at the reactor readings and said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to Captain Dahl and said, very quietly, "The reactor is stable. Containment is holding." The captain closed her eyes. It was the first time Sareth had seen her show any emotion since the alarm had sounded. When she opened them again, they were clear. Damage report, current status. Sareth delivered it from memory. 9 decks were compromised. 6 were lost in the initial fracture event. 3 additional decks sustained partial damage. Terran damage control teams have restored atmospheric integrity to decks 10, 11, and 12. Deck 13 has been repressurized and cleared. Deck 14 remains unrecoverable. The Terran medical team has set up field stations on Deck 8. 34 of 41 wounded have been stabilized. Chief Medical Officer Vaz reports that the remaining 7 are serious but survivable with the Terran equipment now available. He paused. The Terran teams have also performed structural reinforcement on 7 hull sections that were flagged as critical, stabilized the port weapons battery power conduit, and I am told, repaired the secondary water reclamation system in the Deck 8 maintenance bay, which was not on our damage list and which I did not request. Captain Dahl looked at him. They repaired something we didn't ask them to repair. Yes, ma'am, they said it was on the way. The captain was silent for a moment. On the main display behind her, the schematic of the Ashker Ven showed the red sections shrinking, the green spreading, the ship coming back to life deck by deck in a pattern that no Vethkai damage control team could have achieved in twice the time. How many personnel did they send aboard? 42, ma'am. 42 humans did this. Yes, ma'am. Captain Dahl turned to the viewport. The Caldera Point was visible outside, holding station 300 meters off the port beam, her orange and white hull bright in the reflected light of the Pelori Drift's nearest star. "Com," the captain said. "Open a channel to the Caldera Point." "Channel open, ma'am." "Caldera Point, this is Captain Vethran Dahl of the Ashker Ven. I want to speak to your commanding officer." The response came in 3 seconds. A male voice, unhurried, with the flat affect of someone who was monitoring a dozen things at once and had delegated the worry to subordinates. "Captain Dahl, this is Commander Reese, Caldera Point. How can I help you?" "Commander Reese, your people are inside my ship." "Yes, ma'am. Lieutenant Commander Patel's team. They should be wrapping up the spine repair about now. How's the reactor looking on your end?" "The reactor is stable. Commander, I need to understand something. The Pelori Drift is compact space. Your ship is not flagged in any transit corridor within 4 relay jumps of this position. How are you here?" A brief pause. Then Reese's voice, still flat, still unhurried. "We monitor all distress frequencies, Captain, all of them. Compact, Coalition, Mercantile League, Fringe, Independent. If someone's in trouble and we can reach them, we go. We were running a survey mission 2 systems over when your signal came in." "We diverted." "You diverted from a survey mission to respond to a compact military distress signal." "That's correct. The compact has not requested Terran assistance in this sector. We have no mutual aid agreement for the Pelori Drift. Your presence here is, technically, a treaty violation." "I'm aware of that, Captain. If the compact wants to file a complaint, they can send it to our Admiralty office on Terra. In the meantime, I've got 42 people making sure your ship doesn't fall apart, and I'd like to keep them focused on that until the job is done, if that's all right with you." Captain Dahl's jaw tightened. Sareth recognized the expression. It was the face of a Vethkai officer confronting a situation that did not fit inside any of the training scenarios she had been given. The compact had a protocol for everything. It did not have a protocol for this. "Commander Reese," she said, "your people have already saved this ship. What I am asking you is why." There was a longer pause this time. When Reese spoke again, his voice was different, not softer, just stripped of the professional veneer. Captain Dahl, 3 years ago a Terran colony ship called the Meridian Passage had a reactor breach in Coalition space. 1,100 colonists, families, children. We sent a distress signal on every frequency we could reach. The Coalition responded. They sent a survey cutter, 1 ship, 4-person crew. They couldn't do much. But they came. They came because someone was in trouble and they were close enough to try. He paused. We don't keep score, Captain, and we don't check the treaty files before we answer a distress call. Someone's dying, we go. That's not policy. That's what you do. The channel was silent for a moment. Commander Reese, Captain Dahl said, thank you. Don't thank me. Thank Patel. She's the one who went into your coolant spine at 600 degrees. The Caldera Point stayed docked with the Ashker Ven for the full transit to the Kale 3-way station. Patel's team remained aboard, monitoring the coolant sleeve repairs, checking the hull patches, running atmosphere quality tests in the restored sections. During the transit, Sareth accompanied Briggs's team on a walkthrough of the restored decks. On Deck 10, the hull breaches were sealed with the molecular adhesive the humans had brought. Up close, the patches were not elegant. They were functional, thick, rough-surfaced bonds that looked like scar tissue on the ship's skin. But they were holding. Every seal showed green on the atmospheric monitoring panels. Every corridor that Sareth had sealed and abandoned was open again, lights on, air cycling. Briggs walked beside him, pointing out the repairs with the casual confidence of a builder showing a client his work. This one was the trickiest, he said, stopping at a section where the thermal fracture had run along a seam between 2 armor plates. The seam wanted to keep splitting. We had to bond both plates to a backing strut before we could seal the gap. Took about 7 minutes. 7 minutes, Sareth repeated. Would have been 5, but Martinez dropped the backing strut and it bounced off his foot. He's fine, Briggs added, just embarrassed. On Deck 11, they passed the section where Akanjo had cut through the collapsed bulkhead. The cutting marks were still visible, clean, precise lines in the metal. Briggs paused and ran his gloved hand along the cut edge. Akanjo's work. You can always tell. The man cuts like a surgeon. He freed 14 of my crew from that compartment, Sareth said. Yeah, Briggs nodded. That's his favorite part. The cutting's just the means. Getting people out, that's the thing. On Deck 12, the Vethkai crew members who had been evacuated were filtering back to their stations, their scales gradually returning to normal color. Sareth watched them settle back into their spaces and felt something shift in his chest, a loosening, a release of tension that he had not realized he was carrying. They were coming home. To compartments that should have been their coffins, they were coming home. Because 42 strangers with orange suits and unfamiliar tools had decided that coffins were not an acceptable outcome. On Deck 13, Sareth found Drenel still working with the Terran medical team. All 41 wounded had survived. Drenel gestured at the readout screens the humans had set up. The humans brought species-specific medical data for 17 compact member species, she said, preloaded in their field kits, blood gas parameters, pressure tolerances, pharmaceutical cross-reaction charts, all of it, for species they have never formally treated. She looked at the equipment around her. They were prepared to save us before they ever met us. Briggs's team, during the transit, also repaired 11 additional minor systems that had nothing to do with the emergency. A flickering light panel, a sluggish air handler, a corroded valve that had been leaking for weeks, a misaligned cargo rail, a faulty temperature sensor, and 6 other small irritations that the crew had been living with because they were not critical enough to warrant a maintenance request. The humans fixed them because they were there, because they walked past them and saw them and decided that the interval between noticing a problem and fixing it should be measured in minutes, not requisition cycles. By the time the Ashker Ven docked at Kale 3, Her operational status had actually improved from pre-emergency levels. The ship that arrived at the way station was, in certain specific and quantifiable ways, in better condition than the ship that had left port 9 days earlier. Patel's team assembled at the Deck 11 airlock for departure. Sarath was there. He had not been ordered to be there. He had simply come. Patel was the last to arrive. She looked tired, the quiet, physical tiredness of a person who had been working hard in terrible conditions and was ready for a shower and 8 hours of sleep. She saw Sarath and nodded. "Officer Kale, spines holding. Your chief engineer will want to do a detailed inspection at dock, but the sleeves will hold." Sarath tried to find the right words. He was Vethkai. His species communicated precision, not emotion. The Vethkai language had 14 words for different grades of structural failure, and no word for what he was feeling now. "Your team repaired 10 decks," he said. "We lost 9 in 11 minutes, and your people won back 10 in less than an hour. One of the decks you repaired was not on my damage list." Patel almost smiled, almost. The expression flickered at the corner of her mouth, and then settled back into composure. "The water reclamation unit. Yeah, Briggs noticed it on the way past. Figured you'd need clean water when you got the crew back into the restored sections. Took him about 4 minutes." 4 minutes? It was a simple fix, clogged intake filter. Sarath stared at her. She had just spent 26 minutes in a 600-degree confined space, manually sleeving a fractured coolant spine to prevent a reactor cascade that would have killed 4,000 people. And she was standing here telling him about a clogged intake filter as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I have served in compact damage control for 23 years, he said. "I have managed structural emergencies on 14 different vessels. I have never seen anyone do what your team did tonight." "Different training," Patel said. "Different tools, that's all." "It is not all." Patel looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and put her hand on his shoulder. The gesture was alien. Vethkai did not touch casually, but the meaning was clear enough that it needed no translation. "You kept 696 people alive before we got here," she said. "On a ship that was falling apart around you with no backup and no tools and no time. You did that. We just finished what you started." Sarath did not trust himself to speak. He nodded once. The Caldera point detached from the Ashker Ven with the same vast, precise movement that had brought her alongside. The docking collar retracted with a hydraulic sigh, and the orange and white hull pulled away into the bright reflected light of the drift's nearest star. She did not signal farewell. She did not request acknowledgement. She did not wait for the compact to process what had happened or decide how to categorize it. She simply left, the way a current left a shore, not because it was finished, but because there was somewhere else it needed to be. Sarath stood on the observation deck and watched until the engine glow faded to a point and then to nothing. Beside him, Thren stood with her arms folded. Her scales returned to their normal slate gray, the fear gone. "Sub-officer," Sarath said. "Sir?" "The after-action report. When I write it, the Compact Naval Review Board will ask me how a Terran vessel arrived in restricted compact space, violated treaty protocols, boarded a compact military vessel without formal authorization, and performed repairs that exceeded the scope of any mutual aid agreement in existence." "Yes, sir." "And I will have to explain to them that the answer to every one of those questions is the same. They came because someone was dying, and they had the tools to stop it, and they did not consider any other factor relevant." Thren was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be a difficult report to write, sir." "No," Sarath said, "it will be very simple. The difficult part will be explaining why we have no protocol for what just happened, and why, in 23 years of compact service, I have never once seen us do the same." He turned from the viewport. The stars of the Pelori drift were steady and cold and unconcerned, as they had always been, as they would always be. Somewhere beyond them, an orange and white ship was already answering someone else's call. The Ashker Ven's final casualty count was 93. Every other soul aboard 3,907 Vethkai was alive because a ship that had no reason to come had come anyway, and 42 humans who had no obligation to stay had stayed until the job was done. Sareth Kale filed his after-action report the following morning. It was 4 pages long. The Compact Naval Review Board would later describe it as the most unusual damage control assessment in the history of the fleet, not for what it documented, but for the single line he wrote at the bottom, in the section reserved for the officer's personal assessment of the event. He had written, "We lost 9 decks in 11 minutes. The humans won back 10. I do not have a protocol for that. I do not think I need one."